Hello, everyone. I just have a quick question. How many of you know or have been or camped, obviously you all know probably, but have camped in Algonquin Park? Can you raise your hand? Okay, and how many of you know of Camp Tamaqua, just to take a look at that? Great. So my own personal story brings me to my roots here today. I went to Camp Tamaqua in Algonquin Park from the age of 7. So imagine my parents sent me at the age of 7. I had my older brother and sister were both there, but they were not there, my parents. And I was at this amazing summer camp. And what was particularly exciting about this invitation to come here today was because I knew I was just going to be 100 miles from Algonquin Park and where I spent 10 of my summers as a youth. And I wanted to tell you why I was inspired to do the work I do, and probably why many of you are inspired to do the work that you do. When I was 7, 8, 9 years old at Camp Tamaqua, I could drink the water straight out of the lake. Omer Stringer, how many of you know Omer Stringer? Well known at the time when I was at camp, he was a famous canoeist and paddler in Canada. And we would drink the water straight out of the lake. We'd just take a cup, and then 4 years into being at camp, I was told I couldn't do that anymore. And the reason, as most of you can surmise, was because of acid rain. And I could no longer drink the water. And that was a huge impact to a little 9, 10-year-old boy. And what I say here is that my clean tech roots, this interest to be working in this sector, go directly back to being at Camp Tamaqua. Now, I'll tell you one other interesting story. It might actually be something in the water. When I wrote the book, The Clean Tech Revolution, I was asked to write our acknowledgments about 4 or 5 months before the book was published in June of 2007. So at the beginning of 2007, I was writing the acknowledgments to the book, and I stated the reason that I really came to clean tech was because of my summer spent at Camp Tamaqua in Algonquin Park. The day I wrote that, or 2 days later I'm reading the New York Times, and there's an article about a guy named Nick Parker. Do any of you know Nick Parker? Nick Parker has a group called the Clean Tech Group. Now, and in many ways, they're a rival of Clean Edges. But I'm reading this about Nick, and he's quoted in the New York Times saying that his inspiration for getting into clean tech came from where? Algonquin Park. So I don't know what it was about. To me, I don't want to get too metaphysical or too mystical, but I like that that had happened. So let me tell you a little bit about my company. And I realized that someone took my papers away. So did anyone, I think, Rick, do you have my papers by any chance? Thank you very much. He also stole my thunder on a number of other fronts, including the snow story, but I won't mind about that. So let me just tell you a little bit about my company, Clean Edge. We're a research and publishing company. We were started in 2000. We're a little bit ahead of the curve, but we were very much interested in exactly what you guys are trying to figure out here, the connection between technology, policy, and capital. That was what we were concerned with in 2000 when we launched the company. Actually, we launched officially in April of 2001, right after the massive market crashes in the US and around the globe. But we made it through, and we're still here today. And so let me just quickly tell you what we do. We write reports. I've written or co-authored more than 24 reports on the clean energy and clean technology markets. We have our annual Clean Energy Trends report, and we just launched, for any students in the room, a report called the annual Clean Tech Job Trends report, which is chock full of information for people looking for jobs in this sector. We put on an annual conference. We're going into our 6th annual conference in Palm Springs, and again, pertinent to what you're doing here, we bring together investors, policymakers, entrepreneurs, business people, and we really try to figure out, we limit it to 500 people. It's an amazing event, and it gets a lot of cross-fertilization going. As was mentioned earlier, we have stock indexes that we do with NASDAQ. We just launched a 3rd index, which is focused on smart grid and grid infrastructure. We have another one on global wind, and another on US-listed clean energy companies. And then finally, we have a jobs board. And I don't know how we're ever going to make money off the jobs board. I hope we can figure it out. But right now, it's a great resource. There's a lot of jobs posted on there all around the globe. So again, back to sort of the inspiration, I just wanted to read, I'll do the quote again. I find out what the world needs, and I proceed to invent. And what I want to point out on this slide in particular is that it's just not technology invention. If you're a policymaker, if you're a business person, if you're involved in finance, I'm talking about invention across the board. And that was the inspiration for us in writing the book. And that's why we put that at the front of the book. So I want to now go into a little bit about why we wrote the book. We wrote the book for a number of reasons, but primarily we wanted to bring it to a mainstream audience. We wanted to introduce it to a mainstream audience. We wanted to demonstrate that it was becoming a mainstream business opportunity. And I think that if you read the book, you'll see that we did that. Now, it was a little bit of a trick, because the book came out now nearly 2.5 years ago. But I think that it's still very pertinent. We updated for the paperback edition, and a lot of the things that happened then that we have been tracking still stand, and we updated a lot of the companies. Let me quickly give you the definition of clean tech. It harnesses renewable materials and resources. It reduces the use of non-renewable resources, and it cuts or eliminates emission and waste. So this is sort of how we came up with our own definition around it. Now, I think it's equally important to say that it delivers superior or equal offerings as conventional resources that it might be replacing. So I think if you hit those things, you're kind of getting the key points of what's happening in clean technology. So what kind of technologies are we talking about? Well, we divide it into 4 quadrants: energy, transportation, water, and materials. And I think, let me ask you guys, because there's one thing kind of missing from this, maybe if you look at it. Is there anyone here who wants to say, like, hey, but you're maybe missing a sector? Any sector that you... Goes into transportation, so we have that. Very good, so agriculture. And what we decided was that we thought that from really technology-driven stuff, we would cover ag and things like biofuels, because that was part of the value stream. We didn't want to get so broad. But I think that these 4, some people define clean tech and they also include agriculture. But these are really the key things that we're talking about. And obviously some very interesting emerging sectors that were listed there. So clean energy, it's going from niche to mainstream. When we first started publishing information on the clean energy markets, they were very small. They weren't very large. Last year, the global wind industry was a greater than $50 billion a year revenue generating global marketplace. Solar PV and biofuels both got to around or surpassed $30 billion annually. And so those 3 industries combined were almost $116 billion in total annual revenue. These are not small businesses. Embedded in that is GE making $6.5 billion last year from their wind division. Okay? So we're not talking about rounding areas. This is becoming mainstream business. We do projections at Clean Edge. We've tended to actually be very conservative. Our numbers that we were projecting 8-9 years ago have proven to be conservative. But we're looking out 10 years. By 2018, we're seeing about $320+ billion in total revenue from these 3 sectors that we track. So let me talk a little bit. Earlier, someone was talking today, and they were talking about the 1970s. And they're saying, like, this is what it was like in the 70s. Let's not repeat it. And let me tell you one of the reasons why I think we're not going to repeat that. I mean, I'm going to go through that in my presentation today. But this slide that we created actually back in 2001, the very first conference we ever did. So this is a pretty dated concept. I created this slide more recently, a little bit newer imagery. But let me just talk about the themes from the 70s and then the theme today. So we used to say return to nature, go back to the earth. Today we say emulate nature. How many of you know the work of Janine Benyus and biomimicry? So not too many. I highly recommend you pick up that book. It's called Biomimicry, and the woman's name is Janine Benyus. It's a brilliant thesis on biomimicry. We used to say business is the problem. Now we say business is the solution. We used to say be off the grid. Now we don't say that. We were just talking at this table about the whole virtuous grid with plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. We're going to feed into the grid. We're going to become energy producers. Be self-sufficient? Well, we have to be interdependent. I think that's what we're talking about today. Think globally, act locally. I love this saying. It came from David Brower, and I had a chance before he passed away to actually work with him briefly. And what I want to just tweak on that, just a little bit, is to think globally and locally, act in both. So this is a small little tweak. And then finally we say power to the people, and today we say the people need power. So, and that was pretty big when we imagined in 2001 with all the blackouts in California. So now let me just take you through the main driving forces of clean technology. They are costs, capital, competition globally, and I'm going to get into that quite a bit because that's important to everyone in this room. China, emblematic of all of the BRIC nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, consumers, and climate. And again, all of this is addressed in our book. Let me talk a little bit about costs, because I think this is very interesting. The volatility of fossil fuels, everyone has become quite apparent by. We all understand that now. I think this is even, I did this slide maybe 2 weeks ago, so I'm at 70 some dollars instead of $80. But extreme volatility embedded in oil prices, as well as natural gas. Even coal prices have volatility now. In clean energy, there has been some volatility occasionally when we've had shortages of wind turbines, et cetera. But overall, historically, what we've seen, other than a few blips, and the same with solar, with a little blip for 3 years or so, is a steep decline. And we're seeing now, just to put this in perspective, solar PV systems being installed today in the 350 to 450 a peak watt range for large-scale systems. That's well below the tariff, feed-in tariffs that Ontario is going to offer. I'll talk about that in a second. So I think this is an interesting trend and an important one. Capital is a critical driver here. If there's no money, this isn't going to happen. And so what I'm here to tell you today is that we're starting to see some capital movements. And last year, our friends at New Energy Finance publish information every year about global investments in clean energy. Well, you could say that about a third, maybe, of total investments in energy globally, just under a third, ended up going to clean energy last year. $150 billion. This year, obviously, is going to look very different, but it's still keeping up with the other sectors out there. This is a very interesting slide. We actually kept data for years with npower. We now do it with New Energy Finance. These are their numbers on the newer years. But if you just look in the last column here, you can see the change in the venture capitalists in the US are the harbinger of things to come. So look at what they've done. From 2000, they were at less than 1% of total activity that their venture dollars were going to were in clean energy. By last year, it was at almost 12%. This is now the third largest asset class for the venture community. And it's probably poised to be in the top 1 or 2. And in different times, in a recent quarter, it was #1. So this is very important from a venture perspective. It doesn't mean things aren't difficult right now. Anyone out there trying to raise money? It's not an easy time, especially for projects, but it gives you an idea. Let me talk about China briefly, because I'm limited on time here. We went to China to write the book, The Clean Tech Revolution. When Clint and I sat down and started scoping out the book, we said, we've got to go to China. I hadn't been to China since 1984 when I was a college student. I was one of the first wave of backpackers in 1984 through China. I went back, it was a totally changed country. So it's a two-headed dragon. On one side, there's immense opportunity. I don't know how many of you are tracking this, but now the new estimates are we're going to see anywhere between $440, $660 billion spent in China over the next decade on clean energy build-out. We're seeing them rapidly develop their wind turbines and wind infrastructure. The same with solar. 5 years ago, there was barely any activity on manufacturing in solar in China. Today you have Suntech Power and a whole bunch of other key players. They're becoming a juggernaut, a massive force. So I think that's important. You've got the positive side. The negative side, which is driving a lot of this in China, is that they have immense challenges with urban migration. About 2 new Manhattans need to be built each year in China, just to accommodate the influx of people moving into urban areas. The other challenge is they have 16 of the 20 most polluted cities on the planet. And I'll tell you, when I was in China, there was starting to be people who were saying, enough is enough. And I think finally, you see this last slide, or the last piece on that bullet, is they're finding toxins and everything. I don't want to give my kids, they use Chinese-made products every day. And I kind of go, whoa, because they've had so many problems. So they know they need to clean this up. We're going to see what they do. But don't count out China. Big competition for the US and therefore also for Canada. Climate, I don't need to spend a lot of time on this. We were talking earlier as well about Al Gore putting climate on the map. There are other people as well. I think the IPCC has proven 90% certainty that we have real issues here. I think anyone who went through the summer that I just had in Portland knows something different is up. So there you have it. I think climate obviously is going to be a big driver. The question is, what do we do about it? Competition. This is really what you guys probably care most about. Globally around the world, as I talked about China, there are dozens of places competing for clean technology. And let me point something. I read something in the paper. I don't know who it was. It may have been someone here who said, oh yes, the North Bay is the Saudi Arabia of biomass. Can you raise your hand if it was you? I'm not, okay, I don't want to, okay. So I'm going to pick on you now. Here's the deal. There is no one epicenter for biomass. And I use it too. When we did some research, which I'll show you shortly for the Northwest, we were always like, oh, it's the Saudi Arabia of so many renewable energy sources. But here's the deal. There are dozens of Saudi Arabias of biomass, of solar PV manufacturing, of wind turbine manufacturing. So you are competing globally. But the good news is cities, states, and regions are getting behind this, that they see it as a job and economic growth imperative, and that it offers things like energy security and energy independence. So I think this competition globally is there for a good reason. The question is, what do you do about it? This gives you an idea. How many of you know what an RPS is, or an RES, a Renewable Portfolio Standard? Can you raise your hand if you know what that is? So it's limited in this group. So in the US and other places, there are what are called renewable portfolio standards at the state level. We now have more than 24 states with RPS requirements. The most aggressive one being California. My trajectory was Michigan, Japan, California, and then finally Oregon. But in California now, a very aggressive RPS, you can see the figure there. That's astounding, right? 33% of total electricity generation from renewables by 2020. In Oregon, it's 25% by 2025. What I see globally in very aggressive places, it's around 20 to 25% by 2020, 2025. So this is what we're seeing. And even China's at 15%. You can see that in there by 2020. That's a huge accomplishment if they get there. So I told you about the Clean Tech Job Trends report. This is very fresh data. It just came out. The report was released last Wednesday. And what I wanted to show you here, it's probably difficult for you to see, but you can see some of the compensation levels right down the middle of the slide there for different types of jobs globally. And you can see, as one of our co-authors of the report said, these aren't jobs at McDonald's. Not to disparage McDonald's, but these are somewhat well-paying jobs in certain areas. And we saw salaries ranging from $40,000 up to $106,000 for different levels of requirements and different types of academic requirements as well. So from entry level to mid-level to senior level. But there's some good jobs here. And I would say in an economy where there are very few new jobs in the United States today, one of the few areas where we're actually seeing job creation are in energy efficiency, smart grid, electric transportation, solar PV manufacturing, installation, systems integration, et cetera. Up here, I'm not exactly sure or as well versed in what's going on in your neck of the woods. Competition, clean tech job activity. I said that there will be dozens of places. These are the top 15 metro regions in the United States for clean tech job activity. So that was job postings, patents applied, all the stuff that the incubators look at. And you can see, not surprisingly, San Francisco Bay Area is in the #1 slot. But what's also interesting up here is you have Detroit, Ann Arbor. There actually is some job activity. Detroit's in a dire mess. I grew up in Michigan. I grew up right in the suburbs of Detroit. It's sad to see what's happened there, but they're starting to get A123, Hemlock Semiconductors, other companies that are coming in and setting up shop. So those are the top. And then on the right-hand side, and again, we have this in the report, which you can download all of our reports for free. It shows some of the other places around the world where activity is happening. So let me quickly take you through the big 8 in our book. And today I'm not going to talk about many of these in depth, but solar energy, wind power, biofuels and biomaterials, green buildings, personal transportation, smart grid, mobile technologies, and water filtration. These were the sectors that we picked nearly 3 years ago, or when we were writing it 3 years ago, and I think they pretty much stand today. And we go into depth on each of these, and we do breakthrough opportunities. So let's look a little bit at what you guys are all focused on. Here are some companies leading in biomass heat and power, pelletizing and briquettes and other technologies. It still really needs to go to a next stage. We need to figure out, and I'll get into this in more detail later, how we're going to grow these industries. But certainly this is one area of opportunity. Cellulosic biofuel is another area. And we've looked at that closely. I think some people have questioned the life cycle analysis of bioethanol, certainly, as well as biodiesel. But there are some companies working on sustainable biofuels. Here are some of the companies. Iogen, which many of you probably know, has been at this quite a while. My concern for cellulosic ethanol is just how hard it's been to crack the cellulosic ethanol code. It's not been easy. And then I think one area which you all would have laughed at probably 3-4 years ago, and most crowds I went to, now is getting very serious consideration. Algal biofuels. They have their own algal biofuel association now. And I don't know how many of you have heard about synthetic genomics. Has anyone here heard of synthetic genomics? So in the US, this is a big deal because it's run by a man named Dr. Craig Venter. And Craig Venter was the man who decoded the genome before the US government did. He made quite a name for himself. And he started synthetic genomics, and about 2 or 3 months ago, I forget the exact date now, he got $300 million investment from ExxonMobil, which doesn't usually do much in this arena, to develop algal biofuels. So we'll see what happens. But that also indicates just how much money we're talking about maybe to deliver on that. So what do you need to be a good cluster? What do you guys need to figure out to make this work? Well, let me tell you about a clean tech toolkit. We have a whole chapter in the book about creating your own Silicon Valley. So here are a number of things you need. You need to have capital. There's no doubt about it. You have to have R&D support. You need workforce talent, which is part of what some people here are working on. You need the policies, and you need the vision. And when I say vision, it really helps if the mayors in the region, the head of the provincial governments are all behind what you're doing. And you need someone to be carrying the torch. And then there's a how-to guide. And I'm going to get into that actually in a different slide. So let me just take you into that. We did a report. We've done a number of reports for different regions. We did a big report back in 2004 for the city of San Francisco, pretty early on. They wanted to know how San Francisco was going to be a clean tech leader. Interesting now to see that they're at number 1, according to our analysis of the job activity. And we've done work for the state of California, and last year we did a report with a number of nonprofits and foundations looking at where I now live, Oregon and Washington. And so we wanted to know what the key assets were for the region and what the key weaknesses were. We wanted to identify the top 5 opportunities for the region. We showed how the region could create between 41,000 and 63,000 jobs. And we also showed, and this is a big deal for the United States, through conservation efficiency and renewables, which I think is what will exactly happen in the Northwest, how we could get to 75% renewable energy sources, inclusive of hydro, by 2025. So this is interesting stuff. So let me just quickly give you a breakdown of the region's strengths, assets, and weaknesses, barriers, because I think it's illustrative probably for what you are doing. We have a very green culture in Oregon. Many of you probably know that. We're considered that. We have a lot of people who move to the region just to be part of that green ethos. The same for Seattle. There's supportive regional government. There's abundant, cheap electricity. Now that's positive and a negative. It's a positive because if I'm a manufacturer of a green technology, it's a good place to set up my shop. But if I'm a seller of green technology, it's difficult because the electricity is already so cheap in the region. Significant natural resource base, the Saudi Arabia of XXX. Strong manufacturing base. One of the reasons why Oregon has been hit harder than just about any other region in the country other than Michigan is because it relies heavily on manufacturing. And massive export opportunities, primarily to California and to Asia. Weaknesses. We don't have a lot of venture capital activity in Oregon and Washington. I'm guessing that might be similar for you all here. That may be hard. It's a little easier if you're right in Vancouver, right in Toronto. But here in the North Bay, maybe that's more difficult. Limited scale of business engagement and research organizations. We don't have a Stanford. We don't have an MIT. Abundant cheap electricity. Limited managerial talent. I know of a company that's doing very well in Portland. They just opened up a Palo Alto office in California. Why? They needed better talent. That's hard for a region. How do you keep the talent base? How do you nurture the talent base? And for our region in particular, the lack of a 21st century grid. How do you integrate the renewables? How do you move the renewables about? That was a big deal. And so that's just some of the things. So we came up with a 10-point action plan. I'll go through this very quickly, but what I wanted to say to you all here is if you can figure out what your assets are, and you can figure out what your weaknesses and challenges are, and then you can come up with an action plan, that could be a good next step as you're trying to build out this biomass cluster, this biomass center. Because until you know those two things and you actually say, here's what we're going to do about it, you have nothing to check yourself against. And the city of San Francisco, to their credit, when we did a 10-point action plan for them, they hired us a year later to come back and evaluate and do a scorecard, and they had done 7 of the 10 things we recommended. Very quickly, for Oregon and Washington, we said we need a price on carbon. Could come through any number of sources, but we need a price on carbon. We recommended bringing the Washington Renewable Portfolio Standard up to the same standard as Oregon. We said we needed a low carbon fuel standard. Not just a renewable fuel standard, a low carbon fuel standard. Pass aggressive green building codes, foster regional cooperation. Sometimes easier said than done, but what we really meant there was to make sure everyone was working together. Ensure public funding for clean technology. Implement tax credits. Deploy clean tech workforce development, which is actually happening quite nicely in some areas right now, in Oregon and Washington. Establish government procurement policies. The government is one of the largest purchasers of just about any resource or technology or item, so if they can become a purchaser, that helps. And build out the regional smart grid. For this conference, I went out on the web and just looked at some recent stories, because what I always find interesting is whatever topic I go and give a talk on, there's always innumerable stories that have happened in the weeks leading up to it. So these are just some of the stories that have been breaking in the news. And I want to point out the last 2 on the right-hand side. Downtown Seattle, 3 days ago, I believe it was 3 days ago, turned on a new system. It's a company called, or an organization called Seattle Steam. They're a power company. I recommend you go take a look, because here's what they did. They're taking urban wood waste and using it in a brand new boiler that they put in. And what they're doing, and I'm sorry to report this to everyone in the Canadian crowd, is that they're getting rid of their need to import 50% of the natural gas from Canada that they were importing, and instead they're using urban wood waste. Maybe you guys will think that's a good accomplishment, being for the biomass crowd. And they're saying that they're going to be able to offset the expenditure they would have had on the natural gas and buy all the urban wood waste that they need for the same or less. It's about $5 million a year. So that's now going to local economies. It's not coming up to natural gas providers in Canada. And the other thing is they're saying is that they can reduce their carbon footprint, and I have not vetted this, so this is their claim, a reduction of 50% CO2 equivalent. So that needs to be tested. But I guess it's a very clean burning boiler, and it's state of the art. So you guys might want to take a look at that as you're looking at buildings that you're planning on deploying. The other one, obviously, is Ontario's Green Energy and Green Economy Act, which first was, I think, announced early in the year, and then all the details just came out very recently. But that is obviously a huge news item, and I think, of course, important to all of you in this room. So now, if you don't mind humoring me, I don't know that much about you guys here. I hadn't been here yet. But I quickly sort of scanned the marketplace, and I wanted to just give you my quick considerations of your challenges. Don't think all of them will be right, but just quickly go over what they are. You're competing against dozens of other regions around the world, as well as within Canada, because Vancouver's doing a lot in biomass. Capital for project development can be very difficult to access right now, let alone technology creation. Just project development work, really difficult in the US. Biomass waste. Don't just tell me it's not an issue. Let me know how you're going to handle it. What are you going to do with the ash? What are you going to do with the emissions? If it's a positive improvement over what came before it, it's really clean burning, you're using the best technologies. If you're taking the ash and laying it in the forest, or taking the ash and putting it into concrete, let the people know what you're doing with your waste residues. Accurate life cycle assessment is a very important challenge, as well as developing closed-loop systems. And I saw Dr. Trevor Jones earlier today, and I like the bioeconomy sustainability framework that he was laying out. It's an idealistic version, maybe, of what could happen here. But still, if you can figure out the whole life cycle analysis and get into closed-loop environments, I think that's an important challenge that you have to face. I think this one is really critical. You're not a major center. And so, not only are you not a major center, but you're far from a lot of economic centers. I think it's good you have Toronto only 3.5-hour drive away, but it's still a challenge. And finally, you've launched this very aggressive green effort in Ontario. How many of you have been tracking the feed-in tariff? Can you raise your hand if you know much about the feed-in tariff? Let me just tell you, on the solar front, the feed-in tariff is between 44 cents and 80 cents a kilowatt hour. If I can't install a solar system today in that range, and I'm not doing it right, I should be able to install some solar systems at 30-some cents a kilowatt hour. So this is an overly rich subsidy. I hate to report that to the Ontario officials. It's overly rich. If you look in California today, most of the subsidies, am I getting a hiss here? Most of the subsidies are around 12 cents a kilowatt hour. Now, Germany had a 40 to 60 cent a kilowatt hour subsidy. You don't have, it's all right. We can have a conversation politely afterwards. What I'm getting at here is that I'm worried that you might run out of money. It's a very rich subsidy, 44 to 80 cents. Now, on biomass, it's coming in at around 12 to 14 cents a kilowatt hour, and that seems about right. So what I'm saying here is, my goodness, if solar bankrupts it, then you guys are left out. So I'm just saying there may be some readjustments that go on here. Subsidies are great. There are no such things, and to the hissing in the crowd or the one person, let me say this. I believe that there is no such thing as an energy source on the planet today that isn't energy, regulatory dependent, and subsidy dependent. Coal, oil, natural gas are all regulatory dependent and subsidy dependent. So I am all for policies and subsidies that support our transition to clean energy. I'm just saying that could be a challenge if you guys over-architected the price scheming. I think this event is starting to play up your region. You need to play up your regional successes and communicate them throughout Canada and perhaps internationally. Do world-class research and cluster development, and I think, again, that's something that Nipissing is working on doing. Build the case for biomass with sound science and demonstrations. So get those demonstration projects in that you're working on, show the full life cycle analysis, show how you're tapping into government subsidies, show the full picture so people understand how it works. And finally, leverage the provincial efforts. Take advantage of the feed-in tariffs. So we have a chapter in the book on marketing. So I'll just quickly take you through these because I think they're important, not all of them, but in the real estate world, we say location, 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 right? Or for restaurants as well. I think for clean energy, clean technologies, we're talking about cost, cost, cost. This thing has got to be the same cost or less than what it's trying to displace. And if it's less, all the better. Don't lead with the environment. I'm not saying that you shouldn't talk about the environmental attributes, but talk to me about job security. Talk to me about energy independence. Talk to me about local, regional economy strength. And I think that's very important. So these are just some of the lessons. We have a whole chapter on it in the book. Let me just wrap up by taking you through a number of things that sort of were lessons from the book. One is that small tech is going to be embedded in a lot of this. The computer chips that let you run the computer modeling, the biotechnologies and sciences that let you do some of the work that you're all going to do. But that's going to be a big part of the clean tech revolution. Scaling up, I think someone said that today, but what we're going from is very small scale to very large scale. So this is all about scaling up. And finally, I encourage you to think long term. This isn't something, the internet, how many of you worked in the internet? There are people here who worked in the internet. I went through 3 technology waves: consumer electronics in Asia, internet, and then clean tech. Each one about 8, 10 years. Now I'm longest now in clean tech. But this is going to be a long-term thing. In the internet, someone could have a business plan, an idea, set up a website in 6 months and have a going business. That doesn't happen here. We're dealing with incumbent industries, large-scale industry. So think long-term, think like a mountain. Let me wrap up with a quote from the book. We are in the midst of one of the greatest shifts in human history. Within 50 years, we'll look back at the beginning of the 21st century and see it as the tipping point for clean technology. The choice for investors, companies, governments, and individuals is simple. Be part of one of the greatest business and economic shifts in recorded human history, or become extinct like the dinosaurs whose fossils fueled the last great industrial revolution. I thank you for your time today. I look forward to communicating with all of you throughout the day.